your economic health, your physical health, your mental health, and ask kind of the question of what method of transportation and also as a result, what type of neighborhood kind of facilitates and empowers one to have the best chance at kind of enhancing all of those aspects of what it means to be a kind of healthy and successful person. And by and large, walkability and walkable neighborhoods give you the best shot at that.
Hi, I'm Gordon Lamphere with the Real Funds Podcast. On the podcast, we interview key entrepreneurs, activists, and researchers who are shaping real estate and, as a result, our world. On today's podcast, we interview Brad Biehl. Brad is an urbanist, podcaster, and community leader, and an advocate for a more walkable urban world. On the podcast, we dive into the concept of urban living, what walkable cities mean, the tragedy of parking minimums, the power of public transportation, and why livable urbanism is ultimately good business. It's well worth a listen. Brad, thanks for hopping on today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, Gordon.
So why is urbanism important for an investor? Because we have a lot of folks on this podcast that sit there and they say it's all about the bottom line. What makes urbanism important to somebody who's, thinking of making that next development?
Certainly. Yeah. I think, the bottom line thing is interesting, right? Because I do think there's a lot of arguments to suggest that urbanism does go hand in hand with that rationale as well. But from just a high level, right, I think if we're looking at people first, which is kind of the centerpiece of whether you're talking about transactions, whether you're talking about livability, walkability, whatever the case may be, right, the people are kind of at the center of it, whether you're doing it in a pure way or a different way, it's always kind of coming back to the individuals. And at the end of the day, building places, and just to kind of define urbanism a little bit, just in case I know there's some differing opinions and understandings of what that actually means. Unfortunately, as is the case with everything, right? You hear about these ideas in the news when it's some very fringe idea that might unfortunately cloud people's understanding of what it means. Folks have probably heard of 15-minute cities talked about in this negative light of kind of this, dystopian environment where they're going to only want you to go within 15 minutes of your house. And you're going to have these zones in your city and you're not allowed to leave those. That is not what anyone I know that is an urbanist or in this urbanism conversation or realm in the US is talking about or proposing or in any way endorsing. We're talking about at its core, looking at zoning laws, looking at development patterns to change them so that folks are able to access what they want and need on a daily and weekly basis within 15 minutes of their home without having to get behind the wheel of a car to do so. So at its core, that's kind of what it comes down to. I think for most folks, that is a pretty logical and rational thing that they actually would like to engage in. I mean, we can do very anecdotal pieces of evidence for this, such as where do people go on vacation? Folks vacation to big cities like New York, where they don't have to rent a car for the week, or they go to places like Disney World, which at their essence are basically just fake walkable cities that we've arranged in a way. So once you get there, you can park your car and enjoy being in this dense walkable environment for a day or for a week. People pay thousands of dollars to do this. So I think there's a lot of reasons why a developer, someone who's in real estate, should care about this conversation. One thing that I have been talking a lot recently is the National Association of Realtors just came out with their updated transportation and community preferences survey. And every single generation right now has indicated that they're willing to pay more money to live in walkable neighborhoods, what we would call, urbanist kind of environments where those principles are being applied or being understood or being taken to heart in the way we're building, but also living day to day. So you're seeing this as a preference at, again, this is the silent generation. This is Gen Z. This is kind of spanning that whole spectrum. 92% of Gen Z in that survey indicated they would pay more to live in a walkable neighborhood, a walkable environment. But we've seen the majority of all those generations say something similar. So I think from a very bottom line perspective, like you said, right, if folks are willing to pay more to do something, that's good for business. That's good for that bottom line. So you can kind of slice it any way you want. I think that urbanism is important in terms of how we look at how we're building our cities for all of those reasons. We can dive into any one of them more specifically if we want to talk deeply.
So I know you touched on it a lot there, but what really is a walkable neighborhood? Because there's a lot of examples that we hear about of things being very walkable, like you just mentioned Disney World. But Disney World's really not a reality for most
Right.
uh, urban areas. So, what would you say is a walkable area in practice?
No, I love that distinction in that question because a lot of folks, unfortunately, like when you say the word density or you say anything that kind of comes alongside walkability, people always think of New York City. They think of massive skyscrapers, no space to breathe. You want everything to be on top of each other. And unfortunately, again, going back to that, like it's kind of a sociological thing that we do. It's like we always take the most extreme imagery that we can on a concept and seem to apply that as the norm. There's very, very walkable suburbs. There's very, very walkable small towns that are hours away from big cities. Like, this is not inherently, these principles of urbanism, of walkability, are not inherently big, dense, massive metropolis based ideas. They're more principles of small scale, again, development patterns, but also built infrastructure that facilitates more safely the travel of humans in as individuals, but also as groups without requiring the purchase of an automobile and the upkeep of an automobile to do so, and all the unintended and intended consequences of using those things. So from a very tangible perspective, it doesn't just look like a very cheaply thrown together slab of sidewalk that's on the side of a 50-mile-an-hour road, and we say, hey, there's a sidewalk there, this is now a walkable area, right? So I think that's the other thing. A lot of people say, well, that's there, why aren't we considering this area walkable because it has a sidewalk? And it's a lot of the times it's, well, have you ever actually tried to go walk on that sidewalk, as the person that's saying that? Answer is usually no. A lot of times those same sorts of comments are coming from city leaders and things, which is always interesting because they haven't always walked their own sidewalks. They haven't always tried to bike in what they call a bike lane, being, a single line of paint on a road that, again, cars are whooshing by you at 50 miles an hour. So a lot of it is not only just putting in a really basic piece of infrastructure that serves that basic purpose and saying, okay, we checked the box, we did it, but it's actually about the experience that one has when they're in that place. So a bike lane, technically we can put a stripe of paint down and say, hey, this is a bike lane. We could also do a protected bike lane, which, yes, protects the cyclists. It allows older folks, kids to feel empowered to move on their own, but it also provides safety for drivers because they're able to feel more comfortable and confident as they're operating their vehicle too. It allows them a buffer so that they don't accidentally get into a really bad situation that could alter their life forever. And I understand there's a lot of rhetoric that comes from our side of this kind of equation that seems like we're villainizing car owners and drivers a lot. I want to make it clear that is not the stance that I have, and a lot of folks do. We very much are on the side of making this a safer environment for all to move about. And so a lot of these solutions, these infrastructure solutions that I just mentioned, they kind of really do focus on the safety for both parties, and also just the kind of care of the individuals that are operating whatever transit method it might come down to. So yeah, again, from a very tangible perspective, we're talking about protected modes of transportation, so protected sidewalks, protected bike lanes by concrete buffers, planters, things like that. We're talking about public spaces that are more activated via being in practical destinations, being along these routes that people are traveling. Anything basically that's giving people the opportunity, empowering them to get out of their automobile and try to move in a different way, right? It's on us to build these environments to give people a reason to try that style of movement, not to tell them, hey, go out and do it on this really terrible piece of infrastructure and good luck, basically. So a lot of it kind of comes down to that distinction there.
Important that you did touch on that there are small or suburban areas that do have walkability. I live in one. My wife commutes downtown about an hour, probably 3 to 4 days a week via train, and she probably uses the car maybe once a week, and that's to go to Costco, and like that's about it, right? I think there's a lot of walkable areas, and some communities have taken a priority to do that. I'm curious. One of the things you mentioned was a protected bike lane. And I know in Chicago and a lot of the areas around here in Illinois, we've seen a real fight between automobile users and bicyclists around the idea of protected bike lanes. And so I'm curious, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
Please.
What advantage does it give to an automobile user to remove a bike lane and then create a protected bike lane? Because in the city of Chicago, that's been a hotly contested issue.
So, from a very basic standpoint, right, we have about 8 parking spots for every car that's on the road in the United States. So, by and large, I understand it differs based on exact block that you're on or area, but there is an overabundance of parking. We've overparked the United States in a lot of ways, which is something a lot of people don't know because they maybe are in one specific instance. They're like, well, I can't find parking at this one place that I drive to often. But by and large, we actually do have too much parking in the US. So people are always very scared about, usually the sorts of projects you're mentioning, right? Like a lot of times we're proposing taking out on street parking on one side of the street, put in a protected bike lane. And people, a lot of times business owners, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point, are very against that idea, at least at first, very hesitant about that. And obviously, as you mentioned, folks who are used to driving to those destinations are also. What I would say first and foremost is it's a really exciting prospect to get folks who have never tried being a pedestrian or biking somewhere as a primary mode of transportation to do so. And by building actual infrastructure that allows folks to move in a different way than they ever have, there's a real chance at that happening. So I think the first thing is I'm very hesitant of half measures that kind of kill full measures in the long run. And something that I'm very cognizant of is that when we build really stripped down bike infrastructure, like a Sharo, for example, you may have seen they'll put a photo of like a bike that's printed onto the road with like 2 arrows and it's in the middle of the driving lane. Well, I mean, I know drivers don't love that because then the bike ends up in the middle of their lane. I can tell you for a fact, those of us that bike, we hate that too because it is like the scariest environment to be in. And so I think when cities do things like that, it makes everybody a little more hostile towards each other, but it also creates an environment where people then who don't bike or who maybe drive and aren't really in that world as much, they say, well, we built this infrastructure and no one's biking in it. So we wasted this money. And so then down the road, when maybe actual changes that would really make a difference in how we transport ourselves around come about, people are more opposed to it because they say, well, I didn't see people using that before. So I'm always like, let's do the actual infrastructure first because then people will actually be able to use it. When we're doing the half-ass stuff, people don't use it. And then we kind of give fuel and fodder to the other side to say, hey, we shouldn't expand these sorts of services and infrastructure long term. So I would say for drivers, it's really like we're also doing this to kind of widen the group of people who are able to use these sorts of ways of getting around. We're not building these lanes so that the same people that bike right now can bike in those lanes. We're doing it so that kids can bike themselves to school, so that older folks who live in the area can be mobile and get to the store on their own, so that other individuals can try something that is better for their health, that's better for their wallet, and that's just better for our cities and their upkeep costs long term. I think a lot of times people get spooked by an upfront price tag on something like a bike lane, but we know that road costs and maintenance over time is heavily based on the weight load that roads carry. So our cars have gotten bigger. Electric cars are actually heavier than internal combustion engine vehicles a lot of the time. So trucks are getting bigger, right? All of these things are happening. We're putting a lot more weight on our surfaces in our cities, which means that those streets have to be repaired a lot more often, which is a cost that we are indirectly incurring as well. So by investing in real infrastructure up front, we're giving folks an option that is going to free them in a lot of ways, but it's also going to give our cities hopefully some money back to spend on more enriching things and services long term than just simply replacing blacktop every 3 to 5 years or whatever the case may be.
So you mentioned parking minimum debates, and
Right.
I can look out the window right there, and I can see retail that is heavily reliant on parking.
Yep.
And there's certainly tenants that I've worked with over the years that are more retail focused. That their biggest concern, even in relatively walkable areas, is often parking. So let's say I'm, a tenant that's a retail focused tenant. Why is a walkable neighborhood that removes parking better for my business?
Certainly. Well, first of all, on the parking minimums thing, from like a law perspective on that, from changing our zoning codes and things of that nature, the cool thing about it is when you remove a parking minimum, you're not telling people and developers that they can't build parking. You're saying they're not required to build a certain amount of parking, which I think is a really important thing because a lot of times we actually see that developers aren't the ones. And again, this is kind of something that drives me crazy on my side of this whole conversation. Is a lot of people are, oh, big bad developers are doing this, and I'm always like, these developers aren't choosing these parking minimums, they're forced to build a building in line with them. So I always am kind of on that side of like, hey, this actually just gives more choice to the developer but also to what they're hearing from their tenants. So if the answer is truly that they need the amount of parking that minimum constructs, then maybe they're still going to build it. But it is overall, if you look at a whole city or a whole region of a city, it's going to allow for less overall wasted parking to be built. So maybe this one building A needs the amount of units it did, but maybe building C, D, and F didn't. And so now they're able to build half the amount they were because they had an overabundance of parking, but A was still able to do what they were going to do anyway. And I think that's something that gets misconstrued sometimes. It's not that we're saying no parking; it's that we're saying that that should be left up to the circumstantial piece of what actually is driving that specific development. So if you're building a dense housing development on a transit line, why would you need to build this massive amount of parking, considering that most folks are probably moving into that building because they want to be on that transit line? So it's that sort of thing where we're wasting space and money because we know the average cost of building a parking garage is tens of millions of dollars, and we're going to have to pay for that somehow. So it makes a lot of sense on the parking minimum side just to give more choice to developers and indirectly then to what they're hearing from their tenants. From a business perspective, it's been cool to get to know a few small business owners. I can think of one off the top of my head, Barry Green Jr. He runs a plant and record shop in Richmond, Virginia. And Barry intentionally chose his space because it didn't have off-street parking, and he really wanted to kind of embody the sorts of things he believed on an individual level about, like, hey, people, actually the customers we want and the customers that we really are going to rely on are a lot of folks that live in this neighborhood. And so by giving this really human scale chance for people to approach our store and to create this space for bike parking, to create potential parklets down the road or projects that maybe can occupy some of the space that parking would have, we're actually creating a community centered space that is better for business because people are going to feel like this was built for them to actually come and spend time, not just for people who are passing through this area to stop at for 5 minutes and then leave. As you know, and most people who are building or in any way involved in real estate know, like, space is at a limit. It's at a shortage in most places, especially in cities, right? We can talk about way out in the country in a different capacity, but in cities, we inherently have a collection of small spaces and we have a shortage of space. That's why a studio apartment costs so much money close to a city center, right? But yet we don't apply that same logic around space when it comes to parking. So one parking space is about the size of an average bedroom in the United States. Two parking spaces together is the size of the average studio apartment. So why is it then that a parking space that might cost $100 a month is the same amount of room as an apartment that might cost $1,500 a month, right? That space, I know they might be zoned differently, but at the end of the day, we're talking about space being used for one thing and therefore not being used for another. So I think at the end of the day, like, when you start to really think through these things as a business owner, again, I'm never one to speak for every business owner and say anyone that needs parking on their site is like in any way bad or wrong. Like that, I think that's ludicrous and completely out of the question. But I do think there are a lot of circumstances where that space could be better allocated towards a need that would indirectly or directly benefit the business and the customers and allow them to actually spend more time in and around the place where they buy things. We know that when people come to an area and they're there on foot and on bike, that they spend more time in that area and thus are probably more likely to engage in more of the services and buy more of the goods that are there. If you're driving into a place and going to one store and then leaving, you're probably not staying on that road. I mean, just moved back to Columbus, Ohio, here in the Midwest, and there's an abundance of what we would call these stroads, this hybrid between street and road, doesn't really know what it is. It feels like it's not like a highway, but it kind of is because people are driving 55 miles an hour and the sidewalks are really bad and there's like a crosswalk a mile apart from each other. So you can't really walk anywhere. But in those environments, you still get this situation where like people aren't coming to that street usually to do multiple errands at the same time. They're going there to go to McDonald's or Kroger, and then they're going to go back home. Whereas when I go walk down, in the short north here in Columbus, a more walkable area to a store that I'm going to the Kroger that's on High Street here, I'm passing like 40 shops that I at different times go into to buy things. And so every time I'm going by that, there's a chance that I'm probably going to stack errands, I'm going to stack activities, and thus stimulate more economic activity in that area. So I think from a developer perspective, building more mixed use areas, it allows for more of that to take place. But also from a small business perspective, positioning yourself in those sorts of areas allows you to reap the benefits of people who maybe weren't driving directly to your business, but that stumbled upon you or past your shop and ended up coming in and becoming a patron and maybe a returning customer as well and part of your community.
COVID has been a real game changer. I know when you're talking about allocating space and allocating resources that are in demand, like space, some of our more service oriented and also retail oriented businesses really discovered that space outside, particularly restaurant space or brewery space, was much better utilized as tables or uh, ways to expand their business than it was for parking. And I
Yeah.
think that's been in suburbia and moderately less dense urban areas a real game changer. I'm curious if you've seen other examples of that in areas that weren't necessarily tied to COVID directly, or if that was a unique circumstance of the pandemic.
Yeah, there's definitely been cities that were doing it, 2019 and prior. It didn't get as much kind of national headlines as it did obviously during COVID because it kind of became this national idea. It's a good example of like a tragedy or a kind of a tough time, creating a really interesting moment where more people found themselves with this need and this lust to get outside and be in community and, trying to find a safe way to do that led to this really cool thing where we realized, oh, if one car parks here for 2 hours or an hour and eats at this restaurant, pays a couple dollars, at the meter to park, or oftentimes nothing to park in front of that store. Well, that's one customer. But if I can create a space where 12 to 20 people can sit outside and eat and they're going to turn over every 45 minutes, that's a lot more money staying with my restaurant if I allocate that space versus having one parking spot out front. But yeah, we've seen it kind of take place. I mean, I've done a couple projects. I worked with a group in Dallas a couple years ago, and Dallas, when I was living there for a short time, very car centered space, very sprawling area. They experimented with it. We did some projects out in the Bay Area. There was a lot of that going on there. I've seen it here in Columbus, especially during COVID and during the warmer months. They've done quite a bit of it. Cities all the suspecting places as well that you would expect, right? The New Yorks and Chicago's and LA's have had some success with it, but it's been really cool to see it in places like a Dallas and a Columbus and places that wouldn't necessarily always be the first to jump on that aren't as transit based cities that are more car reliant, to still go, hey, this one parking space has a lot more value as a community space or as a space for this business than it does just housing one dormant vehicle for a few hours at a time.
So I like my bike, but truth be told, a lot of times other modes of transit are important. So
Yeah,
let's kind of move into kind of more automotive or rail based transit. So
gotcha.
my my wife is one of these classic examples of someone who regularly takes the train downtown, and we have a number of employees at a wide range of businesses, both that we work with and our own business, that take transportation, such as busing. So, one of the big things that I see in public policy circles is often the fight between buses and light rail.
Hmm.
So, it's a big thing. In
Yeah.
DC, when I lived there for a brief period, it was a huge deal where the DC light rail became a huge spending issue, and I would argue it is an issue. What would you say to a community that's looking to put in more transportation options? Are buses versus light rail viable? And what really does that debate center on?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of folks, to answer the last part of that, which I think is a really key point, I think buses, in terms of the infrastructure transition, is a lot more palatable for folks.
Yeah.
Before you get into cost of it, which I've actually seen very compelling arguments made both ways about cost, again because of that short term versus long term piece. Um, Buses are more, I think more folks who aren't from transit oriented cities can wrap their head around BRT and bus rapid transit as opposed to light rail, because they go, okay, and I'm talking even like in the city offices and the government.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so this road already exists. You're telling me what we need to do is basically just take a lane of this road and allocate that to a bus. That feels more palatable than like, let's lay track and, do everything that's required for light rail. In actuality, you have to do a lot of the same things when you build either of them. So, like, you're still changing all of the intersections to preference the transit, or at least to facilitate multiple modes of transportation. You can't just like put in a BRT lane and then just leave the stoplights the same, because then it's not BRT, because you're kind of at the mercy of traffic or anything that may come about. So then you just have a normal bus system. So it's like there's all these things where you have to do that for light rail. You also have to do it for bus. The difference is with bus is that you're doing it on a pre-existing lane, and you might just be retrofitting the pavement a little bit to handle the heavier vehicle, and also to handle, like, you've seen the classic examples. They usually paint them red, the lanes red for BRT, as opposed to the traditional blacktop that you would see.
Can,
Cars aren't allowed. Yeah, go ahead.
can I break in here? So, can you
Yeah,
explain the difference between BRT and just a traditional bus situation?
yeah.
I think there's a lot of listeners that have no idea what you're talking about.
No, that's a great point. So, a traditional bus system is probably what you've seen in your city. It's a bus that is just on the road with the rest of the cars traveling in traffic, and these are still great. I ride the bus a lot, but the thing about the bus is, again, you're at the mercy of traffic. So if there's traffic, it's going to be sitting in that traffic, which means you don't have reliable travel times, which means the average person isn't going to choose that method of transportation if they have choice. So that leads to a whole slew of issues of that lead to a whole another slew of issues with perception of what who rides buses and what buses bring with them. Um, Largely, I think, a little bit misconstrued, but you can see how that gets there, because if you have an individual who has the choice between driving or riding the bus in one of these very car centric cities that does not have BRT but just has a traditional bus system, it's very hard to convince like a person who's working or doing or has kids to choose the bus option, because in a lot of cases they're like 3 times longer travel time than it would be to drive, because you end up in that traffic, and then it's you don't know when they're going to get there, whereas BRT eliminates all those issues. So just like with light rail, BRT has its own track, we'll call it, but unlike rail, it's not a rail, it's just a lane of asphalt, but it's usually painted red. Sometimes it's buffered, and no just general single occupancy vehicles or automobiles driven by citizens are able to use that lane. A lot of times, like, emergency vehicles might be able to, or others that have a special need, but for the most part, it's just buses in that lane. So what that means is, regardless of what traffic looks like, the bus is going to arrive on time. Other things that go into that is you would change the stoplights so that as the bus comes to them, it would preference that bus the same way that you would have with light rail. So it's essentially a light rail on wheels is kind of the easiest way to think of it, and you would build the surrounding infrastructure in accordance with that. Whereas a normal bus, you basically have a car with more capacity, which still solves some problems, but it doesn't solve the issue of making it a widespread option for many folks to actually consider taking on a daily basis, whereas BRT does.
And so, between light rail and BRT, to get back to that subject, light rail, from what I've seen typically in developments, can be pretty expensive, right? It's not the easiest thing to put in. What's the calculus when cities are looking at trying to establish light rail versus putting in BRT?
Yeah, so it depends on who you ask and again how you do the calculation, but by a lot of metrics, you're looking at a few hundred million per lane mile for the construction of those. Which, by the way, is not that dissimilar to a road in itself. I think that is an important point too. Like a lot of people think that that's like astronomically more than building the highways the way that we build them now, and it's not. And long term, on light rail, you often have way less maintenance than you do with roadway or highway or BRT for the same reason we talked about earlier, right? I think a lot of people might, at first be like, oh, is that true? But if you think about it, right, if you think about your city, when was the last time that you never saw a highway or a road near your house being worked? Like being repaved, being done to it. I can't remember the last time that one of the roads pretty close to me, wherever I've lived, wasn't under a serious construction project. And so that's what you get with anything that's road based. Is there's going to be constant maintenance that is due to asphalt wearing down, that is due to the fact that there's probably more variables and manpower that's involved in that operation. Light rail is in some places easier to automate. It's easier to kind of project out long term with potentially some less maintenance costs than, say, a bus system might have. Um, but if you're just looking at the upfront price tag, building BRT is for them. I like to say for the most part, because someone can probably find an exception, but for the most part is more affordable. And again, I think also from a perception standpoint, more stomachable for a lot of our American cities that are coming from very car centered mindsets. Um, it's a cost that I think more of them are willing to incur because they can also get more public support and potentially less backlash up front in doing so. So depends on how you measure the cost, but usually you're looking at a bit cheaper for the BRT up front.
So you've talked a lot about livable design and kind of sensorial urbanism already
Mhm.
today. What would you say if you had to define something like livable design? What is livable design?
Yeah, so I would say, right, like there's kind of this multi-pronged look at what it means to be a person and what it means to be healthy. So I like to take this answer. You could take this through a lot of the lenses we've talked about today. I like to take it through kind of the individual thing, which is like your economic health, your physical health, your mental health, and ask kind of the question of what method of transportation and also as a result what type of neighborhood kind of facilitates and empowers one to have the best chance at kind of enhancing all of those aspects of what it means to be a kind of healthy and successful person. And by and large, walkability and walkable neighborhoods give you the best shot at that. I would say biking is a close second, but I'm always like walk first because I think it's more accessible for more people. So you're looking at, right, we talked a little bit about the cost of car ownership and all that. The average cost of a car in the United States right now is $48,000 as of last year. Used cars like 35,000. So upfront cost is insane for most people. And then most people are spending 10 to 15 grand a year on their car costs from maintenance to insurance and things like that. So we talk about a lot of things with how expensive like cost of living is in housing. We often don't seem to loop in our car costs to that conversation. And it's actually like next to housing, our second biggest expense in most cases. And it all is going into this car, this depreciating asset that loses like half its value right when you drive it off the lot. So it's a pretty tough situation to kind of convince. Like if you were to give that argument to someone who wasn't already entrenched in our American way of life, it's kind of a tough sell. But we're already pretty entrenched in it because our built environment is set up in a way that it's tough to move around sustainably every day for yourself, being on time places without having a car. So from that standpoint, first off the bat, it's like your financial health is very much bettered by a livable neighborhood that is more walkable or more bikeable, whatever your kind of way you want to define it is in that regard. And then you look at like your physical and mental health, right? There's a lot of studies that come out that talk about how walking is so good for your cognitive function, so good for your memory as you get older, so good for all of these components. So you kind of check that box. Then physical health, right? I always talk about like baking physical activity really low levels of physical activity into your everyday life is a really great way to not feel like you're taking on this burden of, oh, I have to go to the gym and lift heavy weights for an hour a day. Like some people who aren't coming from that as a habit or maybe didn't play sports in high school or college, that's a really tough thing to get into when you have kids and a job. But if you're able to bake small levels of activity into your everyday errands and routines that you were already going to have to do, it's a good way to bake health in to life as a whole. And so I always kind of give the example of a lot of the healthiest countries in the world from a physical standpoint, they probably have a lot less gyms per capita than the United States, right? We probably lead the world in like gyms per capita. I actually would love to do a study on this, but yet our population is a lot unhealthier as a whole than a lot of these other countries around the world. Well, a lot of these other countries around the world, they don't have these big pinnacle workout moments in their day, but they do have exercise baked in at a low level to their life and their lifestyle. And so, from a livability and livable neighborhoods perspective, like I think that is a really compelling argument as well, which is you're able to bring more people along and become potentially a less unhealthy nation, more healthy nation by building neighborhoods that folks are not only just driving home to their neighborhood or their house, but they're actually able to like do things in their neighborhood. I think we often conflate a couple things. We have nice houses in a lot of our car-centered suburbs, so people say like, "Oh, I like my neighborhood," but then you ask them like, "What do you do in your neighborhood?" And then I've talked to a lot of people about this, and a lot of people are like, "I don't really do much in my neighborhood. I mostly just do things at my house." And I'm like, "So is your neighborhood livable or your house is livable?" Like those are very different things. And so when you start to actually talk about the neighborhood function, which again, I think is more important than ever right now because we have the Surgeon General talking about how we're in an epidemic of loneliness. And we know obviously some of the mental health statistics that are going on in this country. And we can talk about ways to handle those. I know people have different opinions. I would argue that if we want to do a real grassroots, bare bones change, it would be let's get people outside and in their neighborhoods from a young age, but also adults just engaging both intentionally, but also serendipitously with their neighbors, but also with the businesses and surrounding kind of networks that just exist within a few square miles of their home as well.
I think that's great, and a lot of people would be thrilled to engage with their neighbors a little more. The biggest thing I hear from all of my friends that are much more, I would say, car dependent
Mm,
or preach a car dependent lifestyle is that cars are the epitome of the American dream and the idea of freedom.
yeah.
So, what would you say to someone who says, "Hey, I think we should have as car dependent a society as possible because it means the most freedom for me and most freedom of my movement"?
Sure. I think for me personally, and just as kind of a disclaimer, my girlfriend and I we're car light, so we have one car that we share. It's primarily her who drives it, so I'm in no way like fully against cars as a whole. I think sometimes, I mean, because I do talk about alternatives to cars most of the time. Um, my goal is to get people to lean off of cars, to wane off of cars as this dependency. So I'm not anti car, I'm anti car dependency. As a first thing, I think that, again, thinking about how our side of this conversation comes off to the other side, I just want to take a sec to say that because I think it is an important note to say. But on the freedom note, it's one of my favorite things to talk about. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the cost of car ownership on an annual basis or an upfront basis. I don't consider that to be extremely freeing. So, like when I pay insurance for the car, I don't see that as freedom. It feels like quite a handcuff that I'm required to pay for to simply move from point A to B in my day to day life. Freedom to me is about choice. So, if we have freedom, we should be able to choose how you move from point A to point B, not be told you have to buy a $48,000 2-ton block of metal to get there. So that's the problem that I have with the freedom argument is it seems like it's the argument. I get the American dream point, but it's the argument that you're free to buy something, but you're also required to buy it, which to me kind of is a contradiction where, okay, so is that actual freedom or is the perception of freedom, but you're actually being required to do something, which to me feels like the opposite. To me, walking and biking is freedom because you're not having to pay for that in the same way that you are a car, but you also have the choice. Again, not being anti any single method of transportation. If I have a 3 mile trip or a 2 mile trip and I wake up, it would be nice to be able to choose if I'd like to walk there, to bike there, or to drive there if I have to. Most people in the United States don't have a choice. It's you have to drive, or good luck, basically. And when, as you know, probably all too well, it's when the cost of housing that's near job opportunities, especially for lower income populations, is so high typically, because those opportunities are typically closer to where more affluent populations live, because people want to live in walkable settings or closer to things that they do. It's really tough to tell people, hey, there's not really a chance for you to live close to where you're going to have to work. Oh, and by the way, you only have one option of how to get there, and it's the most expensive way you could possibly move. And then it also incurs quite a cost on the city as well long term, which again, I think is a point that needs to continue to be hit home, which is that car is not a total independent individual cost. There's also a massive cost that's being laid out to the rest of society and to your city and suburb at large as well.
I know you talked a lot about choice, and there's a lot of folks that would like to choose to have additional public transit in their area, but there are people that don't want it in their backyard. And so, what would you say is the best path forward to kind of address some of these NIMBY issues? I know that Evanston, a community close to where I'm speaking right now,
Yeah.
has tried to really adjust some of that, and they've worked with their mayor and their city council and their city manager, and there are certainly communities all up and down the North Shore here, and so communities all over the country that are working through that. What would be your advice to a community to maybe make that change and maybe improve additional transportation options?
Certainly. So I think a big part of this comes back to the perception piece, which is we've done a really poor job at explaining what we mean when we talk about things like density or transit oriented development or anything that feels anti suburb. We really need to work, I think, to get this image out of folks' head that density is just skyscrapers and all of this concrete on top of each other. It's not. That's a really harsh view of density. What most folks who are talking about on the kind of YIMBY side of this, who are pro housing and pro public transit, pro transportation choice, as you mentioned, it's about building a softer form of density that just exists throughout our kind of urban fabric. What we have in most cities is you have a skyscraper, and then 2 blocks later you have single family homes that start. So there's like this really harsh contrast, because we've basically made it illegal through zoning to build middle housing, so townhomes and smaller apartment buildings. Even developers that are really, and I know quite a few of these that are really eager to build these smaller apartment buildings. Oh, they can't, because the fire code or the building code states that they have to have 2 stairs in their building, and so that this building is no longer economically viable to build a 8 to 10 unit apartment building, because they had to put 2 stairwells in it. So now they have to nix the whole plan, or they had to build this 30 spot parking lot because for some reason their city, based on something arbitrary, decided that there needs to be 2 parking spaces for every bed in this building. So now they have to build a parking lot next to their building, and the math no longer shapes out for them. So I think a lot of it is just kind of changing this perception of what density is, because transportation kind of goes alongside that, I think. And as we do that, we start to realize that like a lot of these softly dense neighborhoods are actually like really enjoyable places to be. Like they don't feel like you're in some like harsh concrete jungle downtown. They feel like you're in a great green neighborhood that just happens to have a few more residents. And so the whole NIMBY thing to me is always interesting, because you're basically doing this thing where you go, I love what I have so much that other people aren't allowed to love it, because that would mean that I have less, for myself, which is always interesting, because inherently, if you love something and your neighbors love something, it would make sense that other people might want to live there too. And so you're kind of contradicting yourself by going, this place is great, but not great enough for you to be able to live in too. And I understand there's challenges with it. And I'm not here to criticize anybody for their, personal belief on that entirely. But I do just think there's a way to build more housing or transit in these areas that doesn't sacrifice your ability to have a quiet little parcel of land, but that also could allow for some other people to also enjoy that space. And transportation, I think, if you're really thinking about, housing and how you get around from your own individual perspective just by yourself, I think you can convince yourself sometimes based on the options that it's going to give you in terms of where you can go. So, like, I've lived in some places that didn't have a certain, transportation line, and then over a few years did, and my life got a lot better when that piece came in. And yes, I encountered some of my neighbors that I may have not have before, and some folks maybe got a little closer to my house that wouldn't have been there before. But I was also able to engage in this pattern of movement and access places in a way that I was never able to before. And it made my kind of community feel a lot smaller. It made my lifestyle feel a lot more manageable in terms of even running to the grocery store. Hey, now I can jump on this streetcar. It feels like kind of just this fun thing. I can go sit there and actually work on my way, right? You're kind of giving back this productive time. I could go a million directions with this, and um, it's kind of a fun one to think about because obviously it's really person to person when it comes to NIMBY. That's what I found. But a lot of the kind of overall belief of it is just, it's kind of this fear of folks getting what you have. And I would argue that you could get something that you don't have right now in the same way by allowing some of these things to come about and be closer to your home.
I'll say most of the developments that we've worked with have been more on the industrial side. And what's always fascinating is everybody wants to have their Amazon package arrive same day, but they don't want the logistics to allow for it, right? So
Yep.
it's one of those interesting tidbits about being a human that sometimes
Yeah.
the reason why something is the way you like it is also the thing that you're fighting most against.
Right.
So um, I'd like to touch on our final four. It's a last set of four questions that we always like to wrap up with, and it gives us a little bit of more information about you, more information about where things are going in the world, and then it inspires us to reach out to more folks. So
Cool.
the first question, and this is one of my favorites, is where do you see transportation and our cities changing going forward over the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I obviously have my ambitions with this question, but I'll stick more to my practical hunch on things. You mentioned BRT earlier. I actually think that that's going to be something we're going to see a lot of these mid to large American cities start to really dive into if they haven't already. I mentioned Columbus, Ohio, where I just moved back to. Part of the reason why I decided to move back is we're finally getting some momentum around some BRT and lines and also protected bike lanes in and around our urban core. So it's actually becoming, at least on the horizon, going to become viable to move around a decent part of our city without the requirement of an automobile. But not just to do it as someone who bikes a lot and is used to biking in car centered spaces, but for to be able to bring, in the near future, a family along with that, and hopefully, some parents and family who are older that have never biked as well, and to really see this kind of groundswell take place. So in cities like Columbus, I think BRT and also more robust bike and pedestrian infrastructure is not only on the horizon, but it's here. It's starting to actually take some form. Other cities of a similar size around that mid to large, 2 million person plus, are really kind of grasping a hold of this idea, and they're starting to really look at how to make it possible. So I think we're going to see a lot of places have at least a preliminary kind of network getting built out of some of those things, which, it's tough sometimes to look at that progress and be totally thrilled by it over a 10-year span. But it's also just the pace of the built environment sometimes moves pretty slow. So I'm just excited to see that piece of it. So I would say more BRT. I think we're having some positive housing changes. I think success in cities like Minneapolis, where they've seen a lot of their housing costs become more manageable because they have followed kind of the urbanist playbook in terms of changing zoning laws, getting rid of parking minimums, getting rid of building height maximums, things like that, especially along transit oriented corridors, because they've been so successful in increasing and sustaining affordability. I think we're going to see a lot of other cities start to do similar things. And so that is going to create really great environments, I think. And it's also not going to take away, as an important note for the folks that we were talking about a couple minutes ago, it's also not going to take away from the suburbs and that style of life that individuals in that capacity also enjoy and maybe have a different preference on. So we're going to see places that have the ability to have both. And for drivers, I think we're going to see them have a little bit more choice in how they get around their city uh, on a daily and weekly basis.
So daily, we sometimes look back in life and regret or want to change something. And one of our favorite questions is, if you could look back and you could give yourself one bit of advice, what would it be?
That's a good question. I would say at a younger age to keep. I mean, I'm still pretty young, but when I was a child, I'll say this was a piece of advice that I think about a lot, which is I wish I would have biked and walked more to practical destinations as like a teenager because I was just like every kid. I was really excited to get my driver's license and like thought that was the coolest thing ever. And looking back, I'm at the area that I lived in at that time. Um, I am like, dang, my friends and I could have had so much fun if I would have moved more the way I do now. Like the way I bike now, if I would have seen that as a really fun thing in my high school years, I think I could have brought a lot of folks along with me in that endeavor, and we would have been able to create some really like wholesome memories, but also great habits going forward. So I would say an piece of advice is, I guess this is also looking towards parenting years, but it's like allow your kid to get out and move in their environment and allow them the autonomy of biking and walking places and find safe routes, go on rides with them, go on walks with them, find good routes and help empower them to move because it's going to free their time up, but also your own time as well. And that's something that excites me a lot. But I would also go back and be like, hey, it's cool that you got your driver's license, but it's really fun, especially when you live in this smaller community that you live in right now. It's really fun to get out and like explore different ways to get around on the bike and things like that. So that would be one thing.
In terms of one of my favorite questions, because I actually apply it on a regular basis, is we love reaching out to folks who are in the arena and getting book recommendations. I'm a big reader. I'm more of an audiobook reader more than anything because sadly I am somewhat car dependent, at least for my work. And so I'm curious, um, what would you recommend if you could have at least one book that our listeners can pick up?
All right, I'll give you a two-pronged answer here. The first book is like 800 pages. I think it's the longest book I've ever read by far. That's what I'll say. So, but it's called The High Cost of Free Parking by Donald Shoup. And I highly recommend this book for anyone who, if what you heard me talk about today doesn't fully convince you, or if it does, but you're just like, I'd love to see some more math and data on that. This guy is like the kind of god of like parking research and as it pertains to urban economics and urban development. He's out in California at UCLA and doing research that is all centered around parking and kind of its impact on our cities, but really from the economic standpoint. So I know there's a lot of folks that talk environmental standpoint a lot. This guy is like very focused on the economic standpoint, which for me is always and it still is the most compelling argument. And it's the one I think we're going to have to keep leaning on to really make the case for this long term. The book goes into all of these studies that different cities around the US and outside of it have done over different years and different programs they've implemented, how to effectively charge for parking, and what you can do with those extra funds as a city, and how you can really make a change in your environment if you choose to utilize parking as this kind of economic and financial tool to kind of really get the true value out of that land and that space and then reinvest it into the community and into these more walkable and livable neighborhoods. So that's a great book if you have a little bit of time on your hands and you can stomach kind of a more textbook-esque type of read. But I highly recommend at least kind of getting a synopsis of that one or listening to some of his talks on YouTube because they are very compelling and very interesting. And I think a lot of folks in the US haven't really considered that viewpoint on a lot of those topics. If you're looking for a more entry level accessibility read on some of these things, the Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs is kind of like the planning urbanist Bible, I would say. Jane Jacobs was not even an urban planner. She's kind of the most famous all-time urban planner in kind of the zeitgeist, but she actually wasn't an urban planner at all. She was like a single mom that lived in New York and then Toronto, and basically was the opponent or one of the leading voices against Robert Moses's effort in New York City to try to put highways right through the middle of Manhattan. And she kind of rallied a lot of the support locally to kind of oppose that and preserve New York and Greenwich Village and being the place that it is today. But she has a really understandable, digestible view of kind of what a good city is and how it functions. And it's very much based on how cities actually operate versus how we think they should, which is kind of a nice, really simplified way to look at things of, hey, this is actually how places best perform based on just how humans behave. It's a lot of observational learning of her just sitting on park benches and walking around different American cities. That one came out in 1961, but if you did look at the date of that book, you would think it came out last week, which is pretty neat to see something like that holds the test of time really well. And that one's a really easy read. Talks a lot about safety in there as well, and really built in authentic kind of organic safety of cities and neighborhoods, and how building and developing so that more eyes are on the street at all times to kind of keep an eye on just the strangers and passerbyers in a given neighborhood really is the best way to achieve a high level of safety at a really low cost. So this book goes a ton of different directions. It'll give you a lot to think about going forward. So that's a good one. And then Street Fight is another one that's a good, really simple entry level one that talks about New York City's transition into a more pedestrian friendly space in the last couple of decades. It's written by the former planning commissioner in New York. And yeah, those are a few good ones. Jeff Speck also has a few books, Walkable City, and a couple others that are really good for entry level understanding of some of these topics about walkability and urbanism. So there's four or so for you, but there's a
Well,
few good ones.
I've got my reading list that takes me back to law school. I'll be just
Oh, nice.
yeah. So in terms of going through and asking questions, there's one question that we really love, and it's the whole reason why we created the podcast in the first place. And it's, who should we have on next? Because
Yeah.
you know better than anybody else that we're going to ask who should be our next guest, and who should we be reaching out to.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's like such a fun thing too, because you end up getting introduced to people that you don't necessarily think you would have had on the show if you were just sourcing guests yourself. I would say an interesting one that just popped into my head as we were having the conversation was someone, whether him or someone like him, Barry Green Jr., who I mentioned, the small business owner in Richmond, because I think a lot of times we lump these business owners into this category of being anti-bike lane and pro parking, and they're the main voice that is supposed to be on that side. And so people like him are really interesting because they've intentionally made decisions to try to orient their business more around a walkable environment, but intentionally seeing that as a strategic advantage for building a really loyal and relatable customer base. So Barry would be a great person to talk to. He also runs a blog on the side called Density Dad, where he writes about kind of raising kids in a dense environment, but doing that again by choice, and the kind of advantages to being a father and a parent in a place that a lot of people think inherently isn't where you're supposed to raise kids by the American standard or something like that. So I think Barry would be really cool. There's also some smaller scale developers that are building and focusing on missing middle housing specifically, whether they call it that or not. One that comes to mind is Kobe Lefkowitz. He does, if you might follow him on Twitter, he's one of, if not my favorite follows on Twitter in terms of he talks about architectural beauty a lot and things of that nature, but develops a lot of small scale real estate projects in that kind of missing middle zone in New York and also in California. So he's a really interesting person that might be fun to see if you could get him on the show as well. Super nice guy, easy to talk to, but also has a really unique perspective at a young age because he comes at it from the developer angle, but he's very much on the side of like the urbanism and walkability through that development. So it's a really like neat spot to be in, and shares a lot of great perspective. And they've both been on my show as well. So good folks. I can attest, good conversations to have for sure. Those are two that come to mind.
Well,
My head.
I have to bring them on. And there's one final question that I have to ask you, and it's, Brad, if someone wants to reach out to you, get a little bit more information, or learn a little bit more about you, what's the best point of contact?
Yeah, so I use Instagram and TikTok primarily because a lot of the content I share is my short form video. So on Instagram, I'm at B Beal, my last name B IEHL, or at in.goodtraffic. That's our podcast channel. And then on TikTok, it's at Cities for People. But if you search my name, it'll probably come up there as well. Those are the main places. I'm fairly active in my DMs answering there, and except for sometimes depends on what clip we posted that week. But for the most part. But yeah, I would love to connect with anybody and talk more on these conversations. And again, I appreciate you for having me on, Gordon. And I'm in no way trying to say that cars are evil and bad, and if you drive, you're a bad person. I always like to kind of end with that note because I think people weirdly take this all very personally sometimes. And I'm like, no, we're not anti-car, we're not anti-driver. We're looking at car dependency and examining that as a overall function and how it could be improved. So I'm really grateful for the time and super grateful for your audience for listening. And hopefully we can start some new conversations as a result of this as well.
Brad, happy to have you on. And we'll have you on in the future. Maybe talking a little bit more about NIMBYism.
Would love it. Oh yeah, my favorite topic.
Thanks again to Brad. We appreciate his insights. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please give us a like, a 5-star rating, or a review. Your comments, interactions, and subscriptions truly matter and help us continue to provide quality guests. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Gordon Lamphere of the Real Finds Podcast. Thank you for listening.